October 1555, Brussels. A great hall inside the Koudenberg Palace, packed with the most powerful men in Europe, and the figure at the center of it can barely walk. Charles V is 55 years old, but he moves like a man twice that age. Gout has twisted his hands and swollen his legs until standing alone is impossible. So when he enters to give the most important speech of his life, he leans on the shoulder of a sharp 22-year-old named William of Orange. Hold on to that name. The emperor is giving it all away. He tells the room he's exhausted, that he's spent 40 years in the saddle defending the faith, and that the Low Countries, what today we call the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, now belong to his son, Philip. Over the coming months, the rest follows. Spain, the silver of the New World, Naples and Sicily, and the Duchy of Milan. The imperial crown, plus Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, goes to his younger brother, Ferdinand. One inheritance split between two heirs. Charles looks at the biggest pile of power on the continent since Charlemagne and chooses to cut it in half. But what if he didn't? What if the dying man kept every crown on a single head, his son's, so that Philip woke up one morning as both King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor? Let's hit Control-Z. Welcome to Control-Z Rewritten, the podcast where we take the biggest decisions in history and ask, what happens if they go the other way? Not random what-ifs, real 50-50 calls with alternatives that were actually on the table. One decision, we hit Control-Z, try it the other way, and see what changes. Charles couldn't give Philip the imperial crown. Every other title he could pass from father to son like a deed to a house. But the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a possession. So the simple version of the what if, the one where Philip just wakes up wearing every crown, hits a wall. The empire wasn't Charles's to give. So let's start with what the man actually held, because most powerful ruler in Europe both undersells and oversells him. Charles ran Spain, the Netherlands, big chunks of Italy, the Austrian homeland of his family, and the silver mines of two American continents. On paper, nobody had ever controlled more. But in practice, it wasn't one country. It was a stack of separate kingdoms that happened to share a single king. Spain had its own laws and its own parliament. Naples kept a separate set. The 17 provinces of the Netherlands governed themselves through local privileges that no monarch dared touch. These places didn't pool a treasury, an army, or even a language. The only thing binding them together was the figure at the top. Historians have a name for this kind of setup. It's called a composite monarchy. And the important word here is composite. Because remove the man in the middle, and the whole thing falls into pieces. The strangest title in the whole pile is the imperial one itself, Holy Roman Emperor. Now, if you say empire to someone, they usually picture absolute rule by one person barking orders, demanding that you come to the dark side of the force, and then blasting you with lightning from their hands if you refuse. The real thing was a quilt of around 300 German principalities, church lands, and free cities, each clutching its own scrap of sovereignty, all loosely stitched under an emperor whose authority over them was thin to the point of transparent, plus far less finger lightning. Charles didn't own that crown. It wasn't a ring he could pull off his finger and pass to Philip. 7 men, known as the prince-electors, chose the emperor by vote. Charles had won his own election back in 1519 by borrowing a fortune from German bankers and outspending the King of France. He essentially bought the seat. This was the Middle Ages version of democracy. And the seat behind it was already filled. Back in 1531, the electors had voted Charles's younger brother into a title called King of the Romans, a clunky medieval way of saying emperor in waiting, the officially designated next man up. But his brother Ferdinand wasn't some understudy pacing in the wings. He'd been running the German-speaking core of the empire for a decade. He'd held the line against the Ottoman Turks when the armies reached the walls of Vienna, and he spoke German. The princes knew his face. The moment Charles stepped down, that crown was legally, constitutionally, unavoidably his brother's. Charles can't simply gift the empire to Philip, so the Control-Z button has to work some other way. It does because Charles tried exactly this in real life, and the attempt left a paper trail. In the years from 1548 to 1551, the emperor ran a quiet campaign to muscle his son into the imperial line of succession. He leaned on his brother to step aside, and his brother said no, obviously. And Ferdinand's own son, a charming, religiously slippery prince named Maximilian, went even further. He rounded up German nobles, Catholic and Protestant alike, and warned everyone who'd listen that the princes would never, ever accept a Spaniard on the imperial throne. They had their reasons. Philip had toured Germany and the Low Countries in those same years, partly to audition for exactly this job, and the German and Flemish lords came away cold. They found him stiff, remote, and unable to hold a conversation in any language they spoke. He was the Ron DeSantis of the 1500s. What came out of that fight was a family compromise in 1551, and everything that follows hangs on it. The deal. Ferdinand would still become emperor when Charles died, but someday, down the line, Philip would take the crown after him while Maximilian governed Germany in the meantime. Now, this is all documented history. We're not into the alternate timeline yet. In real history, the bargain was quietly strangled. When the next succession election came around in 1562, the electors handed the title to Maximilian, and the Spanish branch's shot at the empire evaporated. In the Control-Z timeline, the reversal is narrow and specific. Charles leaves every title exactly where it sits and goes after one thing only, the order of succession. He reaches back to that 1551 deal and makes it stick, years before any deathbed could come into play. Ferdinand still gets the crown in 1556, just as he did in reality. But this time, accepting it comes with a string attached. Ferdinand agrees to spend his authority, his networks, and his decades of goodwill with the German princes, making sure the next emperor in waiting is Philip, with the title leapfrogging his own son, Maximilian. To get the electors to accept a Spanish heir, the family dangles guarantees the princes actually want. The religious piece stays untouched. The imperial crown will never harden into a possession passed automatically from father to son. And Maximilian, shoved aside from the top job, gets a consolation prize that turns out to matter enormously. He'll run the German lands day to day as the emperor's deputy on the ground. Think Darth Vader if he was a fragile 16th century noble. In 1562, the electors cast the vote that in reality went to Maximilian, but this time it goes to Philip. 2 years later, in 1564, Ferdinand dies right on the historical schedule, and Philip II, King of Spain, lord of the richest empire on earth, sets the crown of Charlemagne on his own head. That's the actual move. Forget the deathbed will. The real undo button is a dying man reaching 5 years into his own past, grabbing the machinery of a rigged election and aiming it straight at his son. Let's picture who Philip II is the day the crown lands on him. He's the most powerful king Europe has ever produced, period. Spain answers to him. So do the Silver Mountains of Peru and Mexico, the wealthiest mines on the planet. He holds the Netherlands, half of Italy, and the most feared navy in Europe. He's also a devout, secretive, intensely Spanish man who governs the way a monk prays, alone, in a small room, working through stacks of paper late into the night, almost never setting foot outside of the Iberian Peninsula. The empire is the one piece of this inheritance that can't be run from a desk 1,000 miles away. It doesn't operate on paperwork. It operates on face-to-face bargaining conducted in German at sprawling assemblies called Diets, where the emperor has to physically show up, flatter 300 very touchy princes, and haggle for every soldier and every coin he wants. Philip can't manage a minute of it. He doesn't speak German. He already proved on that youthful tour that he couldn't warm up a room of northern lords if his life depended on it. So the new emperor falls back on the only method he trusts. He rules Germany from Spain by letter through a deputy. And that deputy is Maximilian. The same cousin who got shoved off the throne to make room for Philip is suddenly the one man who must keep this empire from falling apart. The Spanish king fought for years to win the imperial crown, and the only way he can wear it is by handing the day-to-day power back to the very prince he beat. The harder Philip clutches the title, the more he has to give away to keep it from collapsing in his hands. Religion is the next fault line, and Philip sits exactly on the wrong side of it. The year Charles abdicated, his brother had signed a treaty called the Peace of Augsburg, a document the old emperor found so humiliating he refused to attend the signing. The bargain was simple and radical for its time. Every German prince got to decide whether his own territory would be Catholic or Lutheran. Whoever ruled the ground chose the faith. It was an ugly, jury-rigged truce, and it had 3 cracks running through it nobody had bothered to patch. Calvinists, a stricter breed of Protestant, weren't covered at all. The rules for what happened when a Catholic bishop converted were disputed and unenforced. And one clause protecting certain Protestants had been slipped in at the last second by Ferdinand on his own authority, with the Catholics fuming about it for decades after. Ferdinand could live with that mess. He was a pragmatist who'd spent his life cutting deals with people he disagreed with. Philip was something else entirely. He once said he'd rather lose every kingdom he owned and die 100 deaths than rule over heretics, meaning the very Protestants who filled his new empire. And he meant it literally. The German Protestant princes read the new emperor perfectly. They knew he'd never bend the way the old one had. So they did the rational thing. They started buying guns. The money never added up, but it was never going to. Philip inherited a kingdom already drowning. Spain owned around 20 million ducats when he took over. He'd been handed an unfinished war with France, and he would be forced to declare the royal version of bankruptcy in 1557, again in 1575, and once more in 1596. The famous river of American silver, the stuff pouring out of Peru and Mexico, most of it landed in Spain and went straight back out the door to the bankers Philip owed, the German Fuggers and the financiers of Genoa. It was spent before it even arrived. A quick aside here. A king's bankruptcy didn't mean financial ruin or not being able to buy a house for 7 years. It was just Philip telling his lenders that he wouldn't pay them back on time and then daring them to do something about it. Now back to the story. Now let's add the Holy Roman Empire onto that budget. So garrisons on the Ottoman frontier in Hungary, the cost of propping up imperial institutions, and the significant expense of policing 300 princes who resented being policed. New spending, and not a single new source of income to cover it. Imperial taxes had to be begged for, one prince at a time, at the Dietz, and the German lords were not about to bankroll a Spanish king's war in places they'd never see. Meanwhile, Castile, the one part of Spain that actually paid, was already sick of carrying everyone else's problems. The math was a tightening noose, and Philip had just put his head through it. It's important to understand who actually kept this empire solvent. A tight circle of bankers from Genoa, the Italian port city. They ran the most sophisticated money operation in Europe, and Philip leaned on them to survive. Spanish silver crossed the Atlantic in treasure fleets and piled up in Seville, but a mountain of coins sitting in a southern Spain does an army in the Netherlands no good at all. The Genoese solved that. Through a web of credit and paper promises, they could advance hard cash to Philip's troops where they actually stood, in Antwerp or Milan, the moment he needed it, and then collect later from the bullion landing back at home. They were the engine that turned American metal into European war. And they knew exactly what they were worth. The bankers of Genoa lent as a block, moving together so Philip could never pit one against the rest to push his costs down. They held the whip hand, and the price of his borrowing kept climbing. Every loan also demanded collateral, something solid to put up as security. Philip had Castilian taxes and the incoming silver, both of them assets he could sign over on paper. Then he tries to borrow against the Holy Roman Empire, and there's nothing to pledge. Imperial money came from 300 princes bargaining at the deets, granted year by year, never guaranteed, never the emperor's to hand over in the first place. The lenders want a promise he can't make. So the German crown piles vast new expenses onto his books and hands the financiers almost nothing they'll accept as backing for it. The credit machine, already groaning under Spain's wars, begins to seize. In real history, the Dutch rose up against Philip and fought him for 80 years. It's how the Netherlands became its own country. So the question for our timeline is whether Philip the Emperor, with all that extra power, finally has the muscle to crush the revolt before it starts. The answer? He doesn't. He has less. People picture a giant Habsburg empire and assume a stronger Philip simply flattens the Dutch before they can stand up. But the bigger the empire, the weaker his grip on any single piece of it. Spreading himself across Germany and Hungary doesn't give him more to throw at the Netherlands. It just gives him 3 separate fires and only 1 bucket of water. So the schedule of the revolt barely budges. In 1566, Protestant crowds across the Low Countries storm into Catholic churches and smash the statues and stained glass, a wave of destruction history remembers as the iconoclasm. The following year, Philip sends the Duke of Alba, a cold and merciless soldier, marching north with an army. Alba sets up a tribunal to hunt heretics and traitors, executing over 1,000 people. So ruthless, the Dutch christen it the Council of Blood. He also slaps a permanent 10% tax on every single sale, a levy the Dutch called the 10th penny, and the unrest curdles into open war. The man leading that war on the Dutch side, grown up now from the 22-year-old whose shoulder propped up an emperor in Brussels, is William of Orange. Philip's double crown comes with a double curse. In the real Dutch revolt, the rebels eventually went looking for allies among the Protestant princes of Germany, fellow believers fighting the same Catholic superpower. In the Control-Z timeline, that superpower is also their emperor. When the German princes watch Alba's reign of terror unfold next door, they don't see a foreign quarrel in someone else's country. They see a preview of what their own Spanish overlord might do to them when he runs out of patience. William's pleas for help land on ears that are suddenly very interested. The rebellion gets even harder to stamp out because Philip Silver is now split across too many wars, and his cruelty in the Netherlands is radicalizing the exact princes he's supposed to be ruling. Stretched this thin, an empire stops losing money on paper and starts losing people. This happened once in real history, and back then, Philip didn't even have Germany on his back. In 1575, Philip ran out of money and stopped paying the army he had fighting in the Netherlands. Unpaid and furious, the soldiers did what abandoned armies always do. They turned on the city they were sent to protect and sacked Antwerp, one of the richest ports in Europe, slaughtering thousands of civilians across 3 days of looting the Dutch still call the Spanish Fury. The massacre recruited for the rebels better than any pamphlet ever could. It drove the provinces of the Netherlands into one another's arms against the crown. Now, run that sequence again in a timeline where the treasury is also hemorrhaging cash to defend Hungary and keep Germany afloat. The money runs out sooner, the mutinies turn uglier, and the Spanish Fury arrives ahead of schedule, dragging its backlash forward with it. The Hungarian frontier won't sit quiet either. Ferdinand had kept the peace out east the cheap, humbling way, paying the Ottoman Sultan tribute and signing one truce after another, swallowing his pride to stop the border from igniting. Philip is the king who wins Christendom's great naval victory over the Turkish fleet at Lepanto in 1571. Handing tribute money to a Muslim ruler offends everything he stands for. So, the emperor cuts off the payments and pours troops into the frontier. And a long, grinding Eastern war that real history postponed for decades catches fire early, opening a second vast front that feeds on the same silver the Netherlands is already bleeding away. Let's look at the map and the math together, because the geography alone is a death sentence in the 16th century. Philip's main force in the Netherlands, the Army of Flanders, which I know sounds like 10,000 soldiers in green sweaters with mustaches, couldn't get there by sea. The English Channel was hostile water, and the French coast was worse. So Spain built a corridor. Troops sailed first to Genoa, then marched a narrow, carefully negotiated overland route that ran from northern Italy up through the Alps and the neutral lands beyond, 600 miles to the Low Countries. They called it the Spanish Road, and it was the artery that kept the Netherlands War alive. The historian Geoffrey Parker counted the traffic. More than 123,000 soldiers trudged up that road between 1567 and 1620. A slow river of men crossing the continent at 14 miles a day to go fight in the rain. That was the strain of supplying one front. But now, Philip has two. The Netherlands sits in the northwest. The Ottoman frontier lies in Hungary, far to the east. The gap between them runs more than 800 miles, and one treasury is paying for both. Send the troops east to hold Vienna, and they're not in the north fighting the Dutch. Send them north, and the eastern border falls open. He cannot do both. No European state in the 16th century had ever tried to run two great wars that far apart out of a single purse. Philip tries because the imperial crown leaves him no other option, and the seams of his empire start tearing under the weight. France had spent 100 years terrified of being gobbled up, and the dread was earned. Habsburg Spain pressed in from the south, the Netherlands from the north, and the lands of Franche-Comté and Milan plugged the gaps between. The French called it encirclement because they were encircled, and it was the organizing nightmare of their entire foreign policy. Now, drop the whole Holy Roman Empire into that ring of power, all of it answering to one man in Madrid, and French dread tips over into panic. So France does what a cornered great power does. It opens its purse. Money starts flowing to the Dutch rebels and to the German Protestants, earlier and more aggressively than it ever did in reality, where the French stayed out of Germany's religious wars until about 1635. In this timeline, they don't wait that long. They can't afford to. In our own history, when Ferdinand died in 1564, the crown went to his son Maximilian, who governed as one of the most tolerant emperors the dynasty ever produced. He sympathized with the Protestants, he refused to persecute, and for 12 years he let the religious peace hold. But that tolerance is exactly what's missing in the Control-Z timeline, because the man who would have supplied it is stuck running errands as Philip's deputy. Instead of a flexible emperor buying time, the empire gets the most rigid Catholic monarch alive, planted on every fault line at once. Start with the Calvinists. The 1555 peace recognized Catholics and Lutherans and slammed the door on everyone else. This stricter, somewhat brutal, harder-edged branch of Protestantism had been left out in the cold, and its numbers were climbing. In 1563, the ruler of a major territory called the Palatinate, one of 7 men who chose the emperor, converted his whole state to that faith. Under a flexible emperor, it's a problem to be managed. Under Philip, it's a threat to the entire order. To see why, you have to count the votes. The Electoral College held 7 seats, 4 of them Catholic, 3 Protestant. That one-vote Catholic edge was the only thing standing between Philip and the nightmare of a Protestant being chosen to wear the crown after him. Every electorate that drifted toward the Reformation threatened to flip the count, So Philip treats the Palatinate's conversion as the opening move in a war for the throne itself. The second crack runs through the church's own lands. 3 of those 7 electors weren't princes at all. They were archbishops, Catholic clergymen who ruled territories and helped choose the emperor. The 1555 peace had tried to nail those seats down with a single rule. If one of those archbishops turned Protestant, he forfeited his office and his vote. The Protestants never accepted it, and the real version of this fight blew up in the 1580s when the Archbishop of Cologne, the best-smelling of the 3, converted and refused to surrender his electorate. His defiance would have handed the Reformation a 4th seat and shattered the Catholic majority for good, so it set off a war, and Bavarian and Spanish troops drove him out. Now, stage that exact crisis under an emperor who is also the King of Spain and the sworn sword of the Counter-Reformation. Philip cannot allow a single church seat to slip. Every conversion becomes a military emergency, and the German princes watch their own emperor read the map of their faith as a list of targets. Then there's Bohemia, the kingdom in the east that came bundled with the imperial inheritance, and it's full of Protestant nobles accustomed to a very particular deal and a well-known rhapsody. For decades, they had bargained their religious freedoms directly with the crown and won real guarantees in writing. Ferdinand had honored it. He understood that a Bohemian noble with a signed promise in his pocket had no reason to revolt. Philip understands nothing of the kind. He hands Bohemia to a viceroy and governs it by mail, the same cold method he uses everywhere, and the written freedoms get quietly torn up. So in the 1580s, a full generation before it happened in real history, the Bohemian estates rise in open revolt. Stack it all together, and the result is a continent on fire in 4 places at once. A Protestant rising in the German heartland over the Palatinate and the church-run states, a rebellion in the Netherlands that simply will not die, a Bohemian revolt in the east, and a flood of French money pouring into every rebel hand that will take it. The Dutch rebels are the spark, the empire is the dry timber stacked from the Rhine to the Danube, and France is the wind on this budding wildfire. The conflict history scheduled for 1618 instead detonates in the 1580s, much messier and uglier than the original, because underneath the religion lies one raw question: whether a Spanish king has any business wearing the crown of a German empire at all. Philip II dies in 1598, right on time, and the whole jury-rigged contraption dies with him. His son inherits Spain and assumes the imperial crown comes attached, but the electors have other ideas. At this point, they've endured more than 30 years of an absentee emperor who never showed his face at a diet, never learned a word of their language, and treated the proudest princes in Europe like servants waiting on a Spanish lord. They're done. So they make demands of the heir, Philip III. Come to Germany in person, prove you can speak the language, and guarantee Protestant rights in writing. Philip III, a famously checked-out monarch who let a court favorite run his entire government, does none of it. The electors hold a contested vote, and they hand the crown of Charlemagne back to the German branch of the family, the Austrian Habsburgs. Spain and the empire split apart again, formally this time, and permanently. The grand reunion Charles engineered lasted exactly one lifetime. When the fighting finally burns out, the peace that ends it is harsher on the emperor than anything in our own history. The princes who survived won't accept anything short of ironclad sovereignty, the legal right to run their own territories, faiths, and armies with the crown shut out. In our timeline, that settlement arrived in 1648, and history calls it the Peace of Westphalia. The version that ends this earlier war goes further, because the princes had to break a Spanish monarch to win it, and they make certain no future emperor can ever try the same. Four centuries on, After Charles finally got the unity he wanted and then watched it blow up in his family's face, the map looks like this. Start with Spain, the supposed winner, which comes out weaker and broke far sooner. Carrying Germany and the Netherlands and the Ottoman frontier all at once snaps the Spanish treasury a full decade ahead of when it cracked in reality. There's no brief golden recovery in the 1600s. Spain spends itself into exhaustion and stays there. France is the real winner, and it rises early. With the anti-Habsburg coalition forming sooner and the French leading it, the age of Louis XIV arrives ahead of schedule, and France climbs to the top of Europe years before it did in our own history. The biggest change, though, is in the German-speaking world. In this timeline, the power that ends up on top long-term is Austria, governed from Vienna. The ambitious rulers of Brandenburg Prussia still climb because their position on the map is too good to keep them down. But the road that led in our history to a Prussian-built German empire in 1871 is blocked. A German world orbiting Vienna becomes the future instead. The Dutch win too, and earlier, breaking free closer to 1600 than the 1648 of real history. Their golden age arrives right on schedule regardless, the trading companies, the Amsterdam Bank, and the global shipping empire, because all of that was built on geography and money and a knack for commerce, none of which necessarily cares who's wearing the imperial crown. And across the Atlantic, almost nothing changes. Spanish silver still pours out of Peru and Mexico, and the English and Dutch and French keep muscling into the Caribbean and North America on roughly the same timeline. The Habsburg succession drama, for all of its fireworks in Europe, barely registers in the Americas. The real decision, the one that actually happened, was to divide. Sit with it long enough, and it starts to look like the wisest move Charles ever made. He spent his whole life chasing a single dream, one unified Christian empire with himself at the head of it. He poured 4 decades and more than one fortune into fighting for it. The French, the Lutheran princes, the Ottoman armies hammering the Eastern door, he took them all on, and he never got to finish. Then, at the very end, sick and bone-tired and propped up on a young man's shoulder in a hall in Brussels, the most driven ruler in Europe did the one thing his ambition had never let him do. He admitted it was too big. He cut his life's work in half on purpose, handing Spain to his son and the empire to his brother, because somewhere across those 40 grinding years, he'd learned the brutal lesson. No single human being could hold all of it at once. For 400 years, that division has been filed away as the sad ending of his story, the moment the dream died. But if you flip the timeline, it actually reads the other way around. That division was the smartest, most honest thing he ever did. The road we just walked down, the one where he keeps it whole, is the one that poisons everything it touches. Charles, at the end, when he finally stopped fighting, was right. The young man whose shoulder held up the old emperor that day grew into his son's worst enemy. William of Orange spent 3 decades at war with Philip, tearing at the empire Charles had spent a lifetime building. The dying man handed his son the inheritance of an age, and without ever knowing it, handed him the rebel who'd helped pull part of it down. Some decisions you don't get to take back, not even when you're the most powerful person alive. Decisions don't get do-overs, but on this show they do. If you like the show, please rate and subscribe wherever you happen to be listening. It helps other people find the show and allows me to understand whether people actually enjoy it. Until next time, I'm Kevin Perez Allen. Thanks for hitting Control Z with me.